Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's Berlin lecture. The Berlin lecture of the Berlin Institute for Empirical Integration and Migration Research is our main annual event, and it has the ambition to present recent insights from advanced and politically relevant research to an audience from academia, policymakers, journalists, culture, and many other actors of the civil society of the capital of Berlin. This year's lecture addresses an issue which has become, thanks to the Fridays for Futures movement, one of the most, if not the most, important political issue in the current political debate, climate change. Of course, this issue was always one of the major challenges in our society and has been widely discussed since the famous report of the Club of Rome all over the world. Nevertheless, the topic has become more and more timely against the background of recent insights of research in conjunction with social movements all over the world. Although the developed countries and some emerging economies such as China are mainly responsible for the CO2 emissions in the world, the consequences are felt much more in other countries and in poorer countries. And this is, of course, one of the main triggers of climate migration internally, but also externally. That is the issue which we will address today, not only from the perspective of advanced economies, but also from the perspective of developing and emerging economies. Today's lecture on climate migration will be delivered by Professor Frédéric Docquier. Frédéric Docquier is professor at the Catholic University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, and he is also head of the research group on cross-border mobility at the Luxembourg Institute for Economic and Social Research. Frédéric has started in an unusual manner his academic year. He was a famous soccer player in Belgium, in the second league, I think. And fortunately, in the later steps of his career, he moved to economics, fortunately, because there are many important contributions to our field. He received his PhD in 1995 from the Université de la Méditerranée in Aix and Marseille, and his habilitation from the University of Lille II in France. Before he moved back as a full professor at the Catholic University of Louvain-la-Neuve, he was associate professor at the University of Lille. Frédéric has become famous in the economic field for his outstanding contributions to the new economics of the brain drain. For those who are not familiar with that area, the new economics of the brain drain endogenize education decisions and finally finds that the impact of the brain drain on sending countries is ambiguous. Frédéric is coming from economic theory, but he has also major contributions in the empirical field. So he has established databases on the brain drain and has contributed to advanced empirical methods as well. He's working not only on the brain drain, but also on economic growth and many other experiences, many other phenomena. And it's not by accident that somebody with such a broad background also contributes to the area of climate change. Frédéric has published a lot. He is one among the top 2% of all economists worldwide in the rankings. His major contributions are on the brain drain in the Journal of Economic Literature, but there are also many, many other publications. Yes, today we will have first the lecture by Frédéric. We will then have a political panel, which I will introduce after the lecture. The floor is yours, Frédéric. We are very excited for your talk.
Well, thank you so much, Herbert, for this very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure for me to be with you today, and it's a great honor to take part of this Berlin lecture series. I would say that I'm super happy as well that Herbert will visit us in Luxembourg in a couple of months, and I hope that I will be able to give him or the same kind of nice introduction that he gave me. So I'm going to talk today about climate migration. Climate migration means the migration or mobility response to climate change, to long-term climate change. Climate change is really a hot topic today. Well, hot topic, it's not a bad joke here. I just wanted to mean that figuratively and literally, climate change is more and more discussed in policy spheres. And international migration is also a source of lively debates. It has been a source of lively debates for now a couple of decades, but especially after the recent so-called refugee crisis that we had in Europe. So it's not surprising that if you combine these two concepts together, climate change and migration, you are on a super hot topic. It's not surprising to see that this concept of climate migration has given rise to more and more reports by international institutions. Probably that the most famous one is the recent report of the World Bank, the Groundswell report, which produced quite large numbers of climate movers for the 21st century. But you not only have reports, you have also a lot of newspaper articles dealing with this topic and usually concluding with, let's say, alarming claims describing climate migration as a threat for the world economy or a threat to our societies. I just picked up a few headlines of recent articles dealing with climate migration, headlines from the last 12 months, more or less. So you can read with me, "The world should be ready for climate migrants." Climate change will create the biggest refugee crisis of all times. And this second article is clearly explicit about the fact that we will have a massive inflow of migrants, of climate migrants, from poorer countries to high-income countries. These climate migrants should be treated in the same way as we treat political refugees today, so people crossing the borders to seek protection. A migration juggernaut is headed for Europe. So again, another paper or another article discussing the fact that we will have massive inflows to European countries. All these reports and articles are showing, and I will come back to that with numbers, are showing that the effect of climate change will be the most adverse in poor countries. So the countries that contributed the least to global warming, to climate change, will be the most severely impacted. So what is underlying these newspaper articles is that we will have a massive inflow from the poorest countries of the world to high-income countries. And honestly, when I discover this type of claim, I'm always a bit surprised and I'm always a bit skeptical about the intensity of the phenomenon. The reason is that if you look today at the relationship between emigration, out-migration, outflow of people, and the level of development of the origin country, you would expect, in economic sense, that this is a decreasing relationship. Okay, when the country is very poor, you have a lot of people fleeing their country and trying to move to the north. And when the countries are becoming richer and richer, they migrate less. But in fact, it's not a decreasing relationship that we observe. We observe an inverted U-shaped relationship. Okay? So at low level of development, and low level means below $6,000 of income per capita, you have between 50 and 60% of the world living below that level. The relationship is increasing, in fact. When people get richer, they migrate more because they have more capacities to finance migration. And if climate change is deteriorating their situation, you would expect that they migrate less. So we have to be very careful with this inverted U-shaped relationship. We should not interpret that as a causal relationship, but that means that it's not obvious at all that if we impoverish with climate change the poorest countries of the world, there will be a massive outflow of people. On the contrary, if people are trapped in these very poor regions and declining regions, the real problem is not climate migration. The real problem might be climate poverty, the increase in extreme poverty, which is driven by climate change. So the question is, where is the real threat? Should we fear a massive inflow of climate migrants, or should we fear a rise in instability in many countries and a rise in extreme poverty? And this is just a question that we have addressed in 2 recent papers with my co-authors, and I would like to summarize, let's say, these two papers, how we proceed and what we find in these 2 works to you. Maybe a few words to contextualize the things that we've done. I don't think we can deny the fact that climate change is a process at work. It has been at work for 250 years, since the Industrial Revolution. So many climatologists have shown that the temperature has already increased by less than 1 degree Celsius. So the increase is limited, but the temperature has already increased for the last, let's say, two and a half centuries. And the sea level has risen as well by about 20 centimeters. So it's not a lot, but the process is at work. And the process has accelerated since 1980. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of these changes have been observed over the last, let's say, 30 to 40 years. What is more important is that all climatologists today are predicting that the process is going to accelerate further in the 21st century. And when you look, I'm not a climatologist, but when you look at the predictions of climatologists, you see that they predict for the 21st century, depending on the scenario, depending on mitigation policies, they predict a rise in temperature which goes from 1 to 4 degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees, which is enormous compared to what we have seen in the past. And they predict that the sea level is going to rise by 1 to 2 meters, which is much more important than what we have seen over the last 250 years. You have even more pessimistic scenarios, many more pessimistic scenarios in the literature. But these are, let's say, the moderate scenarios we can work with. And for someone like me who has devoted his research career on migration or to migration for the last, let's say, 20 years, this is really a fascinating problem because we know that these effects will be heterogeneous across countries. There are many reasons why countries will be impacted differently. The first one is that countries are differently exposed to the rise in the sea level, depending on proximities with oceans, with seas, with rivers, deltas, or estuaries, depending on the level of elevation of the country, the land topology, so they will be impacted differently. The second thing is that depending on the development level of the countries, they have different adaptation capacities. It's very likely that many rich countries will adapt by building walls or dikes to protect themselves to a limited rise in the sea level. This is what the Dutch people have done for a long time now. It's much less likely that poor countries will be able to make this huge investment to protect themselves. And so in these poor countries, migration is more likely to be a natural response to the rise in the sea level. The third reason is that the effect of the rise in temperature will not be the same everywhere. The effects are highly nonlinear. Suppose that you have +2, 3 degrees everywhere on Earth. it makes a strong difference if you start with a level of temperature of 12 to 15 degrees, like in Western Europe, this is the mean temperature we have, or if you start with a level of 25 to 27 degrees, which is what you have under the tropics and close to the equator. So the same rise in temperature is going to impact productivity and the economy in a very different way. And the last thing is that all the economists who have worked on this topic have shown that agriculture will be the most severely impacted sector. And poor countries are highly specialized in agricultural goods. So that means that they could move to a less agricultural economy and develop a manufacturing sector, but this is costly, this is tough. You need to recycle people, you need to change a lot of things, you need to invest. So it's very likely that climate change is going to generate favorable conditions for increasing labor mobility on Earth. Mobility from flooded to unflooded regions, mobility from agriculture to non-agriculture, so let's say rural to urban, mobility perhaps from rich countries to poor countries. And that's what we are investing in here. The problem is that we are in kind of uncharted territory. We know nothing about the way climate change is going to affect future migration. There are plenty of papers in the literature, an exploding number of papers looking at how migration responds to specific weather shocks. You know, temperature shocks, shock in rainfalls, natural disasters, landslides. You have plenty of papers looking at how people react to these specific shocks. And you have just a few papers who have analyzed the long-term changes in temperature and in rainfalls and their effect on migration. But because the effect is so nonlinear, it's very difficult to extrapolate or to believe in an extrapolation of these results for the 21st century. You see in the data above that the change we expect for the 21st century are much bigger than the changes that we have experienced over the last 30 years. So extrapolating what we have found over the last 30 years is a nonsense. It's meaningless. That's why you need new approaches to evaluate or to quantify the potential effect that climate change will have on the economy. And what we do in our project is to use a more structural approach. Instead of regressing, explaining mobility as a function of temperature, and then using projections of temperature to predict future mobility, which is, I think, not the right method, we proceed differently. We identify the climate shocks. We look at how these climate shocks are going to impact the income, the level of health, the health conditions of people, the surface which is livable, the space livability in a country. And then we use these shocks, what is called damage functions in the literature, to predict how people react to these damages. How do they react to income losses, health conditions, deteriorations, and so on? Okay? So I'm going to focus first on the first part. Can we define this damage function? How climate change is going to affect, let's say, the income and let's say, the variables of interest for people on Earth. Long-term climate change consists of, let's say, three basic ingredients. The first one is the rising mean temperature. Okay? In each country, we have projections of future temperature, and we see that everywhere the temperature is going to increase by a certain amount depending on the scenarios. The second one is the rising sea level, which is going to imply forced displacements of people. Some areas will be flooded, and migrants will be forced to move. And the third ingredient is the fact that climate change is going to increase the frequency of extreme events. So let me document these three aspects one by one. To document the rise in the sea level, we use the projection data, the most official data you can find today, which are collected by the World Bank on what they call the Climate Change Knowledge Portal. So you can find all these data, they are publicly available, data on the level of temperature that we have today, the mean temperature by country, which is on the left graph, and data on future temperature levels, so projections of temperature. So on the left, you have the current temperature today. And I plot that against the latitude of the country. So on the vertical axis, we have the latitude. 0 is the equator. Above 0, you have the northern hemisphere. Below 0, you have the southern hemisphere. All countries are represented, and you see that you have this relationship. So obviously, temperature, which is measured on the horizontal axis, is much higher under the tropics, which is obvious, than in the north or in the south. So basically, in Western Europe, we have a temperature, a mean temperature level, which is around 12 to 15 degrees today, while at the equator, you have a mean temperature, which is between 25 and 27 degrees. And on the right, you have the change in temperature between 2010 and the end of the century, 2100. Of course, we have it month by month. We have all these scenarios month by month. The World Bank has classified these projections by scenarios. The first type of scenario is about CO2 emissions. So they have 8 scenarios about CO2 emissions, if I'm not wrong. So we took the median CO2 emission scenario. And for each CO2 emission scenario, they have asked many institutes to predict future temperature levels. So you have optimistic institutes predicting low temperature changes, and you have pessimistic institutes predicting large changes. We took the median of these temperature predictions. So we took the median of the median, which is, let's say, the most plausible scenario that you can find in this website, in the World Bank website. And when you plot the change in temperature compared to today, you see that it's almost a flat line. It's not correlated with latitude. You have almost +2 degrees everywhere, except in the extreme north and except in the extreme south. But these are really outliers. So in this median of the median, +2 degrees. And you have, of course, more pessimistic and more optimistic scenarios. But we start from this benchmark for the 21st century. The fact is that temperature is connected with productivity. We divide the world into 2 sectors. So each country has an agricultural sector, and each country has a manufacturing and services sector, okay? And above, you see the top graph on this slide, you have the relationship between temperature and productivity. The continuous line is for agriculture. For agriculture, the optimal temperature is 21 degrees. And if you deviate from this optimum, then you have the gain in productivity if you start from the left, or a loss of productivity if you start from the right. This is already a curve which accounts for adaptation mechanism. In fact, you can have this curve for many crops. And they took the envelope of all these crops, which means that suppose that you have +2 degrees or +3 degrees, if temperature changes, farmers are going to switch from one crop to the other. And here you have the optimal crop for each level of temperature. So this is really the relationship between productivity and agriculture, which applies to any country in the world. This curve is quite narrow. You see that it's quite centered around the mean, around the maximum, which means that if you start from the left, a small increase in temperature is going to increase productivity in a relatively drastic way. If you start from the right, on the right of the optimum, the same increase in productivity is going to, the same increase in temperature is going to decrease productivity in a drastic way. Okay? And the dashed line, the dotted line, is for manufacturing. And it's much flatter, which means that the optimum is at 18 degrees. If you deviate from 18 degrees, if you have global warming, let's say an increase by 1 degree, 2 degrees Celsius in temperature, the effect on productivity will be much smaller. If you look now at the 2 bottom graphs, left and right, we have injected, we have fed the productivity relationship with this +2 degrees. So +2 degrees in temperature affects productivity in a negative way under the tropics and in a positive way above the tropics. And when you look at the line, which is the continuous one, you see that in agriculture, close to the equator, the productivity might decrease by 20 to 25% in agriculture, okay, if temperature increases by 2 degrees. While above the 35th parallel, and we are above the 35th parallel, the effect will be very small, perhaps slightly positive. And the dashed line, the dotted line that you have on the left graph shows you the effect of +4 degrees. If we have +4 degrees of temperature, then the loss at the equator will be around 50%. So the agriculture will be 50% less productive than today, which is really a strong impact. The right graph gives you the same function for manufacturing, so non-agriculture. Qualitatively, you have the same shape, except that the intensity is much smaller because you see that the curve above is much flatter. So basically, in manufacturing, +2 degrees will decrease productivity by 10%, close to the equator, and will have this positive but very small effect in the north. So this graph clearly shows you that the countries that are going to suffer from +2 degrees or +4 degrees are clearly the poorest countries of the world, which are under the tropics. So that's for the link between temperature and productivity. Then you have the rising sea level. We would like, in a simulation, in a projection exercise, to have a projection of the sea level which is consistent with temperature. And the rise in the sea level is something which is super difficult to predict. Okay? It depends a lot on the speed at which icebergs are going to melt, or the dynamics of heat uptake of the oceans, plenty of things that are very difficult to predict. But still, there are a few climatologists who have linked the rise in temperature with the rise in the sea level, and there are 2 papers at least producing very converging results. They show that if temperature increases by 2 degrees, the sea level should increase by 1.1 meter. And you have much more pessimistic result in some papers. And if the temperature increases by 1.3 meter, if the temperature increases by 4 degrees, then the sea level is going to rise by 1.3 meters. So on the map, you have the share of the population in the world which lives below these levels, and especially 1.1 meter for the top graph. Many poor countries have a high proportion of their population living below that level. Assuming that OECD countries high-income countries will protect themselves against these rise in the sea level, and that developing countries will not be able to protect themselves, you have on the bottom graph the share of the population which will be forcibly displaced, what we maybe call climate refugees, even if I will come back to the definition of what refugee means later on. And in the Maldives, for example, you see that this share is around 50%. And you have other countries in which this share is, let's say, between 25 and 15%. Okay? And the last thing is the frequency of extreme events. So the temperature distribution is going to change drastically. When you look at the mean is represented by the dashed vertical line that you have on this graph. So you have the distribution in 2010, so as of today, more or less, and you have the distribution in 2100 by the end of the century. So you see that the move from the first dashed line to the second one on the right is this +2 degree increase in the temperature. But the distribution changes, and it shifts to the right. So that means that on top of this change in the mean temperature, you have also a change in the proportion of days within a year above 20 degrees of temperature or above 30 degrees of temperature. And economists have shown that above 20 degrees, labor productivity starts to decrease, especially in agriculture. And above 30 degrees of temperature, we have health problems. The health cost is very important. So we can, in fact, use the health cost of heat waves and the labor productivity losses due to heat waves and feed that into a model. So you have these three effects. Productivity, on average, depends on the mean temperature of the year, okay? And this is the first effect. Second effect, the rise in the sea level displaces people. There will be forced displacement. And third effect, we expect more heat waves, more extreme events, which are going to induce income losses due to lower productivity, health problems, and natural disasters. And this is what we put into our model to predict the migration responses. So just a few words about this model. So now I'm going to talk very briefly because it becomes much more technical. So I just give you, I sketch you what we have done in this model. Now we care about these damage functions. Space livability is reduced. There are income losses, productivity losses, health problems, natural disasters. How does it impact the mobility of people? So just in a nutshell, we have built a world economy model with all the countries of the world, virtually all the countries, except very small islands, for which, of course, the problem will be super severe, but we have no data for these very small islands. But many small islands will be completely flooded, so it would be great to have them in the model. We do not have them in the model so far. And in each country, you have two types of adults, of workers, high-skilled, low-skilled, working in two regions, agriculture or non-agriculture, and part of these regions can be flooded if the sea level is rising. So these are what we inject in our model, and then we predict how people move. They can choose to move locally, as close as possible from their place of birth. So suppose you have a rise in the sea level and you have to move, they move 10 kilometers away. They can move to another sector, from rural to urban, or agriculture to manufacturing, or they can move to another country, and especially to a high-income country. This model has been parameterized. We have given, let's say, values to the parameters in such a way that we perfectly reproduce the situation of today and the responsiveness of migration decisions to the past shocks. So if you take this model, calibrate it on the year 2010, parameterized in 2010. You feed this model with the past demographic data for 1980, 1950, and past economic data, and you predict migration in the 50s, in the 80s, in the 70s, this gives an excellent fit. So we are very confident that this model has a very good predictive power. And then in this model, we feed it with these climate scenarios, with these damage functions, and we predict how many migrants we will have in the future. Okay, so we do that for the whole century under constant migration policies. We can speak about migration policies later on, but our simulations are based on constant migration policies. So high-income countries are not changing their immigration policies. So, most important part, what are the numbers that we can put on the table? So, I remind you, we have a couple of scenarios. The first one is a minimalist scenario. So basically, it's a reference scenario with no climate change. We know it's not attainable. Today, we will have climate change. We will have a rise in temperature. We will have a rise in the sea level. But we use that to have a basis of comparison. And we will compare the climate change scenario with this minimalist one, and you will have really the causal impact of climate change on all these variables. Then we have the intermediate scenario, which is the plus 2 degrees and plus 1.1 meter in the sea level. Okay? Then we keep the same scenario and we add the fast onset variables, the effect on natural disasters, the effect on health cost, and the effect of heat waves on labor productivity. For these three effects related to extreme events, they are less cleanly calibrated. So we separate them because we know there is a big deal of uncertainty about these effects. Okay? Then we have the maximalist scenario, 4 degrees and 1.3 meters in the sea level. And we also considered a scenario in which climate change is going to impoverish people in such a way that there will be conflict over resources. Conflict due to the scarcity of water, for example, drinkable water, okay? And the literature about conflict or climate-related conflict is super mixed. Even for the conflict in Syria, there are papers showing that climate change in Syria played a key role, and other papers are showing that it's not the case. So it's really something very uncertain. But there are also papers showing that the countries at risk of climate-driven conflicts are Western Asian countries, Iraq, Iran, Syria is already in conflict, and Afghanistan and so on, and the countries at risk of social instability, which are the countries in which extreme poverty is very high. So we take 10 countries with the highest extreme poverty levels, 7 countries for Western Asia, so 17 countries, and we assume that there is a generalized and persistent conflict in these countries. How many migrants do we have in all these scenarios? And these are the results. So let's start with the intermediate scenario. Intermediate means plus 2 degrees, plus 1.1 meter in the sea level. On the left, you have for the 3 periods, we start from 2010, so you have for the 3 periods, 40, 70, and end of century, the number of people who choose to relocate locally as close as possible from their place of birth, which is now flooded. You have in light gray people who choose to migrate internally from agriculture to cities, to manufacturing. And in yellow, you have the number of people who migrate internationally from poor countries to rich countries. You aggregate these numbers, and you have about 100 million people. Aggregation over the 3 periods. So there will be 100 million people, but people means here people aged 25 to 64, so workers. If you add dependent children, more or less 1 child per person, this is more or less 200 million people. So it's a lot. It's a number which is clearly in line with the World Bank report. But the difference with the World Bank is that now we are able to separate international migrants, interregional migrants, and local migrants. And you see that the peak is really in the first half of the century, because everybody predicts that the sea level is going to increase rapidly before 2050. The effect you have later on are mostly due to temperature, to the change in temperature. But you see that the yellow part is relatively small. If you aggregate the yellow part, you have about 22 million people who will migrate over the century to the north. 22 million over 3 periods, 3 generations, 3 periods of 30 years. So that means 7 million people in each period, which is relatively small. Okay? Most of these guys will migrate locally, because locally, that's less costly. Today, migration is really costly, and in poor countries, moving abroad is really a strategy of last resort. Otherwise, we would see huge migration rate today from poor countries. We have 1% of the population today migrating from the poorest countries of the world. Then we add the fast onset variables, calibrated less cleanly. So the health cost, the cost of heat waves and natural disasters. And it does not really change the picture. It adds only 5 million workers over the century. And the yellow part is still very small. So most of these migrants will remain local and interregional migrants. Okay? On average in the world, without climate change, by the end of the century, we would have 3.2% of international migrants in the population. We have 3.4% today. And with climate change, it would be 3.5. So not a big change in the proportion of migrants. Then we consider the maximalist. And with the maximalist, things become relatively larger, much larger, I would say. So now you have 160 million adults moving, accounting for their children. That means 320 million people moving. The yellow part remains the minor one. But now it was 20% or 22% of the total before. Now it becomes 1/3 of the total. So here we predict almost 50 million adults over the century, which means something like 17 million per period, which is really a lot. But this is the minor part. You have many more local migrants and interregional migrants. So the conclusion of these, and I will give you another set of results in a moment, but the conclusion of these results is that most of the climate migrants will move internally, but the number of international migrants is not negligible. We have something like 25 million in the minimalist scenario and something like, let's say, 50 million of international migrants in the maximalist scenario. But how does it impact immigration rates from the south and the proportion of immigrants we have in the north? The graph, or the table on the top, gives you the evolution of immigration rates, the fraction of people living to the OECD countries over the century. You see for Latin America and the Caribbean that we have 3.8% of movers today going to the north, mainly Canada and the US, and this proportion will be 6.7 by the end of the century in the intermediate scenario, plus 2 degrees and plus 1.1 meter. So this proportion doubles. Then if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we have a number of 1.3 in 2010 and 2.2 by the end of the century. So everywhere you see this number or this immigration rate increasing, almost multiplied by 2. But if you compare the situation by the end of the century with the minimalist scenario and maximalist, so no climate change or bigger climate change on the right, you see that the difference is not that large. So it's not climate change which drives this increase in immigration. What drives this increase in immigration? It's the fact that in the projections, the education of people in the south is going to increase, and educated people migrate much more than the low-skilled. In the poorest countries of the world, college-educated people with university diploma migrate 20 to 25 times more than the low-skilled. So if you increase education, immigration, the average immigration rate increases, and this is what drives this trend. Climate change adds a little, but it's not the major determinant of this increase in immigration. And if you look at the bottom, under constant migration policies, so suppose that Germany does not change its policy, Belgium does not change its policy, the US does not change its policy. Okay, you have the same type of result. So you look at the USA, today they have 16% of immigrants in their labor force, not in the total population, the labor force. And this is going to move to 23.1% by the end of the century in the intermediate scenario. So plus 7 percentage points. You have the EU 15 and Germany below. So take Germany, 15% of immigrants in the labor force today. It's slightly above the share in the population, probably. And it moves to 26%. So without a change in the policy, without more restrictions on immigration, we will face a higher migration pressure. Why? Because people in the south are more educated, so they are more mobile. But even more importantly, population growth in Germany, in Europe, is relatively small, close to 0. And population growth in developing countries is increasing. We predict that the share of Africa will triple in the population of the world over the century. And so for the same immigration rate, if the population triples, 3 times more people will move. So we should expect in the future more migration pressure from the south because population growth is high in the south. But when you look at the effect of climate change, these are the last 3 columns, you see that climate change plays a role. It's not negligible, it's not 0, but climate change has a very limited impact compared to the socio-demographic forces, population growth and education growth in the south. So typically, the message is that climate change will add a little to the number of migrants, to emigration rates and to immigration rates in rich countries, but the effect should be limited compared to the other forces of migration pressure. The only scenario that we have in which a lot of people could move internationally is the scenario with conflicts. But this is a very pessimistic scenario. We assume here that in 17 countries, West Asia and mostly Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a permanent and generalized conflict. In that case, this adds something like 80 million people more, which are a mix of climate refugees and political refugees. It's difficult to define them. So basically, these are the results that I wanted to share with you. And just a few concluding remarks from that study. If you look at the number of international migrants due to climate change, we move from 210 million people in the intermediate scenario, 2 degrees, 1.1 meter. In the maximalist, it's 120 million more. If you add conflict, it's 80 million more. So basically, the number goes between 200 and 400 million people. That's a lot, and that's clearly what the World Bank report is providing. So we have very similar results than the World Bank on this basis. However, we characterize where people go, while the World Bank says nothing about that, and we see that only 1/4 to 1/3 of these international migrants, climate migrants, will move internationally. Because it's very costly, as I said, it's very costly to leave low-income countries. So usually international migration, long-haul migration to OECD, is a strategy of last resort. So this will have limited effect compared to demographic and socio-demographic forces, so the rise in education, except if we let's say, assume that there will be generalized conflict. So the key message I want to convey with you is that climate change might threaten a bit migration pressures if you are afraid of migration, but the main threat is not the climate migration threat. Climate change is generating a severe development issue, severe development problems. The effect on global inequality and extreme poverty will be drastic. You have the loss of GDP per capita or income per capita on the top graph, which shows you that in many countries close to the equator, in the intermediate scenario, the loss will be around 10% or even more. In the Philippines, I calculated that it's 14% of income per capita loss. And in the maximalist scenario, where you have 4 degrees and 1.3 meters, the loss is almost double. So in the Philippines, it's 25% loss in terms of income per capita. They will not be poorer than today because you have technical progress, and without climate change, the GDP at the end of the century of the Philippines would be 2.5 bigger than today. But compared to this potential of 2.5, more GDP than today, climate change is reducing that potential by 15% in the intermediate scenario and 25% in the maximalist scenario. So this really needs preventive measure, but local measure. It's not a problem of migration, it's really a problem of development and extreme poverty here. So the conclusion is that climate poverty is really the real threat to all of us. And these results are, let's say, collected in these 2 papers that are on my website, and you can consult them easily if you want. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much, Frédéric, for this very insightful talk, also a bit depressing talk. I think we have learned a lot about poverty, climate change, and migration there. And we learned also a lot about the inequalities arising there. And we had a look into the toolbox of economic sciences dealing with that. Now, let's move to the panel. And first, I want to introduce our distinguished guests. I start with the left to me with Ambassador Maria Dizon-De Vega. She is ambassador in Germany since this year. She has had many senior positions in the Foreign Office of the Philippines, and she had several positions abroad. She served as a Consul General in New York. She has other postings in the United Kingdom, in Hong Kong, China, and Mexico. She has a legal background. She has strong interests, as I have learned on her homepage, also in culture, in arts, and of course, in politics. And she's also very well known for her record in taking care during her diplomatic career on the most vulnerable groups of Filipino migrants abroad. So she knows about the phenomena we are talking also very much about from a practical side. Left to her, we have Cem Özdemir. Of course, it's not much I can say about Cem Özdemir what the people do not know here in the audience. He is born in Bad Urach, and he has a Swabian background. He studied social education and joined the Green Party in 1981. He served in the German parliament 2 times, from 1994 to 2002, and since 2013 he was in the European Parliament, and he was for 10 years head of the Green Party in Germany. I think Cem Özdemir is the most visible voice in German politics who knows 1 or 2 things about migration, given his personal biography, but I think it's going much, much beyond. He played also a leading role in the negotiations, which eventually failed, for the so-called Jamaica government. And I will come back to this in the discussion because it's an interesting question. How would climate policies would look like if we would have another government, or maybe we will have in a couple of months another government in Germany. Yes, then we have Catarina Lobenstein on the panel. Catarina Lobenstein is journalist for the paper Die Zeit. She is born in Jena. She studied politics and music sciences in Marburg, Bologna, Leipzig, and Riga. So she has a strong migration record, if I may say so. She works for the journal Die Zeit since 2012 in the economic section. Now she is in the parliamentary section here in Berlin. And she has a very long track record in reporting and analyzing topics of international migration. She was as a journalist on the sea rescue cruises in the Mediterranean Sea, and published recently an interview with Giovanni Perri, a very famous migration economist from the University of California. Finally, we have on this panel Tadzio Müller. Tadzio Müller studied political sciences and is an expert for climate justice and international politics of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And he has also a long record in working on the links between climate change and economics. He has published an interesting book, so together with Stefan Kaufmann, a study on green capitalism crisis and the no end of growth. He is also an expert for social movement, and he argues that the Fridays for Future demonstrations are one of the most important developments of the last decade. This expertise is very welcome here on the panel. Yes, let me start with my first question I want to direct to Ambassador Dizon-De Vega. The Philippines are, as we have learned, one of the most affected countries worldwide from climate change. That may become visible already today, but it will become much more visible in the closer future. On the other hand, the Philippines are also well known as one of the main sending countries of migrants all over the world. Yeah, and it would be nice if you could share with us some of your insights on what's going on in the Philippines, also what will be the likely consequences on poverty, on internal migration, on external migration, and what are the political options to deal with that.
Thank you very much, Professor Brücker, and thank you very much, Professor Docquier, for that very, very interesting presentation. I attempted to read your two papers, the 2018 version and the 2019, and then I got lost in all the graphs. But the presentation this evening has made it a lot clearer. And just an initial comment on the conclusions presented and the findings presented by Professor Docquier. And then, then I go to the Philippine situation. First of all, congratulations on that study. There are very few quantitative studies on modeling migration and the effect of climate change as a migration driver throughout the world. And I think for the Asia-Pacific region and for the Philippines in particular, this is very important. And some of the findings that you presented do tend to be validated by the Philippine experience, at least on the ground level, on the practical side, in the sense that for Philippine migration, at least 10 million out of our 112 million population are overseas. So that's about just a little under 10% of our population is overseas. And that also means that a significant number of our population have connections overseas. And so there's this multiplier effect of migration. But largely migration overseas or external migration of Filipinos is still economically driven. Whether it's to address livelihood issues or to address, as you mentioned earlier, people who have attained a certain level of education wanting to be exposed to career development. So they go and they seek experiences, career experiences, professional experiences elsewhere, but it's still largely economic driven. And to a very, very smaller extent, socially driven. By that, I mean people-to-people issues like marriage, family as a driver, family unity as a driver of migration. Climate change as a migration driver in the Philippines is still at a very, very insignificant level in terms of external migration. Very, very few Filipinos migrate because of climate change factors. They migrate internally. Many people in the audience perhaps will be familiar with the super typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines in 2013. At around this same time of the year, you know, there's something, I think Tadjo mentioned it earlier to me, that there's something that's like a psychic joke from the universe, that whenever the COP, the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC takes place, there's always a typhoon hitting the Philippines, and there's a typhoon hitting my country right now, although it has weakened already. But it really triggers more internal migration than anything. In the case of Typhoon Haiyan, you're looking at two scenarios which took place. One is rural to rural migration, meaning they go to the next town or the next city, which provides more stability in terms of their livelihood. You have people living along the coastline, moving inwards, moving to higher ground, which of course creates its own challenges in terms of livelihoods, in terms of community integration, in terms of emotional or psychic integration. And then the other pathway, of course, is rural to urban migration. There was a case in point, there was a recent forum on climate change and migration held in the Philippines by partly co-sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And they looked at the case study of a community in Leyte, in Tacloban, which was among the hardest hit by Typhoon Haiyan. And they had relatives in highly urbanized areas near the capital, just within the periphery of the Philippine capital in Manila, in Cavite. And there was a call for assistance from relatives who were already in highly urbanized areas to come and help with reconstruction of the affected areas. But the mayor of that particular town, that highly urbanized location, said, no, you can't do that. It will deplete our workforce in the highly urbanized area. So what he did was he created a community to accommodate the internal migrants from the affected areas. So there's still largely this movement, but which is not to say from the Philippine perspective that we don't see the nexus between migration and climate change as being non-existent, because it does exist. In other countries, in other climate vulnerable countries, for example, in the Caribbean, in Haiti, for example, I do recall when that devastating earthquake in Haiti, the US government at that time offered temporary visa arrangements for climate-driven migrants to the US. I'm not sure if that scheme is still in place, but it has been availed of by a few other countries. Perhaps not under the precedent. It all depends. It's because it's also partly politically driven. You know, these policies are politically driven. But in the Philippines, largely it is internal in nature. There is a 2012 Asian Development Bank study which echoes some of the results of the World Bank study and also some of the results from your study, Professor Docquier. And there is also a more recent paper by Oppenheimer and I think Praktisha Bashri, which also tried to measure, to look at the correlation between agriculture, the effect of climate change on agriculture, the effect of precipitation on agriculture, and migration in the Philippines. And the results are still largely that it affects internal migration, but not external migration, because that's still largely economically driven. But of course, the Philippines as a whole supports the idea that when we talk about migration, climate change also has to enter the picture, that there is a certain nexus in the same way that global public health cannot be separated from questions of climate change. So that's a very important thing. So if you've been following recent developments in the global migration discussions, for example, the most recent of which is, of course, the conclusion of the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration, which I think is a record breaker in the sense that I was in New York at that time, and we were involved in the early discussions on the Global Compact on migration. From September of 2016, it took the working groups less than 2 years to come up with the text of the Global Compact, which is actually a listing of objectives. Migration and climate change-driven migration is embedded in that document for the first time. Of course, the downside of the Global Compact is that it's not a legally binding agreement. And at most, it is a moral obligation to achieve certain objectives. And this is where we go back, we circle back to what Dr. Docquier mentioned earlier about certain climate change factors are also, they're mainly developmental issues. And I think for the Philippine experience, for example, we're seeing now, because we're one of the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable countries, that we do have to revisit developmental policies, adaptation, for example, making our communities more adaptive, more resilient. A lot of the climate change disruption which takes place in the Philippines involves the agricultural sector, and 30% of the Philippine population is dependent on agriculture. And you know, there have been some best practices in place already. For example, coastal communities have had to adapt to going inside, going to higher ground. And that's very difficult for people who have lived their entire lives subsisting on fishing and now having to find other means of livelihood. That is where government policy, where grassroots organization, where civil society, and in the case of the Philippines, even international bilateral partners like Germany come into the picture, or multilateral partners like the UNDP, to keep the capacity building and the policy towards capacity building very robust and resilient and innovative, to allow the communities really to be able to adapt to these things. By the way, when Typhoon Haiyan took place, there was a move from a small sector in the Philippines to lobby the US for a similar temporary visa arrangement. But the Philippine government said, no, we will rehabilitate, we will reconstruct, we will rebuild communities on our own. You don't have to leave the country. And that I think is still largely the majority perspective on this. So let me end there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, Cem Özdemir. I think the Green Party in Germany has a very, very long record in working on climate change since its foundation. I personally remember an election campaign in 1990 where you made a climate election campaign, which I think failed eventually there, but I think it was also at that time an important issue. We have now a picture here from Frédéric Docquier, we have a picture here from the Philippines, where we get the impression that perhaps a lot of political things have changed, also perhaps thanks to the Green Party and a lot of social movements, but relative to the challenges that are perhaps minor changes and much more has to be done. And what we do see in Germany, we have political changes at the municipal level, at the federal state level, at the national level, and many of those changes, I think, are due to political pressure, initiatives, practical policies of the Green Party, not only, but it played a key role. And yes, what I said when I introduced you in the beginning, we could think about a counterfactual scenario. Yeah? What would have happened in Germany if we would have now a different government, a government where perhaps the Green Party is involved. And that could have happened with the Jamaica coalition, and that may happen in a couple of months. We do not know yet. And my question is, what kind of political measures or in what kind of ways you will address in the future this major challenge which is on the table here?
Well, thank you. It was very exciting to listen to you, and I would have wished that more of my colleagues would have a chance to listen to your results. But coming back to your question, well, I came with good mood, and then you mentioned Jamaica. Thanks for that.
That's awful. Sorry for that.
But, well, that's life. It will be forever part. Let me be frank. I think we would have achieved a lot on the phasing out of coal energy. We would have been much further than the current Grand Coalition. But regarding another topic that I'm pretty much busy on, transport, we would have not achieved a lot because we had a blockade from Christian Democrats both and liberals at the same time. That's why I would wish if we find ourselves again in a situation that we have to renegotiate about power in Germany, that we have one partner but not two partners, because the situation of having Christian Democrats, liberals, and the Greens, just to give you a hint how you have to imagine such negotiations, you have on that side the liberals, which are most far away from us on the fight against climate change, and then on this side of the angle you have the Greens. So a potential compromise between Greens and liberals is something like the Christian Democrat position. As you can imagine, that does not really satisfy me. So that's why I would prefer having negotiations with one partner than with another partner. That leads me to another point. If you would have made this conference, let's say, half a year ago, no, not half a year ago, 2 years ago, or even 3 years ago, I would have said, in Germany, quite different from the United States, we have a national consensus that climate change is taking place, that there is scientific proven that it's human-made, and it's something we have to fight against. And then, of course, we have the differences under the several different parties about the steps that need to be taken, about the speed and the urgency and so on. That today, unfortunately, is not the case anymore, because we have not only a racist party, but we also have a party that neglects the very existence of climate change, or some of them say, yes, climate change is taking place, but it has nothing to do with human effects. That's the AfD party. And if you look at other European countries, you will see similar effects, that the right-wing extremist parties are in most of the European member states. The parties and go beyond Europe. You find similar things with the President of the United States. The ones who also think that climate change has nothing to do with our agriculture, with our economy, and you name it. So that is one effect, and the second effect is the party I already mentioned, the Liberal Party. If you ask them, of course, they would not refuse that climate change is taking place and it has a human impact, but they would question the role of Germany, and they do. And that also has an impact on the Christian democratic position. I'm sure you all have heard that in talk shows and in articles, that they say, well, Germany is such a small country, we have like 80 million citizens, it's, let's say, 2% of the climate emissions in the world, so why don't we not talk about India, China, the US and others, instead of talking about Germany? That completely overseas. I don't think we're very successful and convincing if we preach others that they should do something against in the fight against climate change, but we Germany, we don't have to, because we were the sinners in the past. So therefore, if we want to be convincing, we need to start in our own country and practice and prove that you can have jobs, an industrialized country, but at the same time reducing in a drastic way your carbon emissions. Because if we have, as the fourth largest economy, are not able to prove that, nobody will follow us. So therefore, this is a very, very dangerous argument, because it sounds very convincing in a talk show, in a meeting, if somebody says, well, we're so small, why should we talk about those steps in Germany? With the same money, we could have a huge, larger effect in other countries. So this, to sum up, is the danger in which we are. And my final conclusion would be, well, after I have listened to your presentation, it can make one really going nuts, knowing that the impact of what we would have to do today costs less and has a much higher effect than doing the same things in 10 years from now. I mean, all experts tell us you need much more drastic measures and the result will be less if we don't start today. So everything what we need is there. Most of the products we need to reduce our carbon footprint are already invented. There is no reason not to start with it. But let me conclude by saying, as I already mentioned, I mean, I think most of, at least the people here on this side, and I'm sure pretty much the same is true for the rest in this audience, will agree easily about the need to fight against climate change and what is necessary here and elsewhere. But the problem is, at the end of the day, and you mentioned that in your question in the beginning, in order to really do the necessary and sometimes drastic changes, you need majorities. So my party is benefiting from Fridays for Future. We have the highest election results in the last elections and in the opinion polls, but we will not get 50% probably. We will still need a coalition partner, very likely. We just talked about last time it was 2 partners. It's not clear whether it will be 1 partner next time. So that partner, very likely, will have very different opinions on the need for a transition in agriculture, for a need for a transition in transport policies, in energy policies. And then, since you know the political system in Germany, we have a 2-chamber system. So most of these legislation we're talking about has to go through both chambers. And then, as you know, we have the European level. So in order to make the drastic changes we need, you need to have a support on the local level, on the Länder level, on the national level, and on the European level at the same time. Otherwise, there will always at least one level that tries to slow down and block what you're doing. And That is why I say, in an ideal world, we would have a consensus under all the democratic parties that goes beyond 55% versus 49%. Because the very size of the project we're talking about needs a consensus from the left party over the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Liberals, and Christian Democrats. But unfortunately, we're far away from achieving that right now.
Okay, thank you for that realistic statement, I would say. Yes, Catarina Lowenstein, you're a professional observer of German politics with also a very international stance. If we hear that, we get the impression, okay, we have on the one hand a big problem on the table, but the political system is not able to deal with it. Yeah? So there are two issues, one which economists would call external effects, that if each country feels it's too small to change, and Germany is one of the main contributors of CO2 emissions in the world, and if Germany says we are too small, and if we go to the election campaign in the United Kingdom, it's exactly the same argument, they are too small to change something. What do you think might be, do you think this is a realistic outcome, that nothing will change or nothing adequate will happen, or do you see political options as an observer that things will move on?
To be honest, I don't know. It's hard to say, but to add an even more pessimistic view on that, I would like to mention that we have like you described it just now, the problem to find a solution with your partners like the CDU or FDP. We always have another party sitting on the side, which is the AfD, and it puts a lot of pressure on the conservative parties. And one thing we haven't mentioned here, which I think is very important and has to do something with this sort of pressure, is that at the moment we have a strong interest by refugee advocates and groups like the UNHCR to protect the Geneva Convention from expanding to the refugee, climate refugee subject. So what they are arguing is we should be very careful about naming or calling people who flee, have to migrate because of climatic reasons, to call them refugees, because it might result in getting less protection for the people than we have now. So there's a strong interest in protecting the status quo, as in we have the Geneva Convention that has been a powerful instrument to protect people fleeing from persecution, for example. And this is, I think, a danger we are facing, that a lot of European countries are either ruled by or have right-wing parties that have a very strong influence on the ruling parties, that they will be probably pretty timid about expanding this, because they are just afraid that it is an invitation for countries that are on the right-wing spectrum, like the rulers, and that they would just say goodbye completely, like getting out of the game, and like with the result that people who are in need of protection don't get it as they did before. I think this is a very important point we should have a look at. And another pessimistic thing I would like to add is that I found it very interesting, Professor Docquier, what you said, that the real problem is the poverty we are facing. But if we have a look at European migration policy, this is actually increasing the problem. I had to think of a farmer that I met in West Africa, in Ghana, and he was a migrant worker. He was harvesting tomatoes in Burkina Faso when there was the season for harvesting tomatoes. And when the season wasn't, like when it wasn't the season, he was working in Ghana. And what happens is the seasons are all mixed up because of the climate change. They can't rely on it, they can't really predict when do I have to migrate. So it is complicated already, but what adds onto that is that the European Union is about to install like a border regime that has never been there. We have the West African Union that actually wanted to be something like the EU, like a liberal union, like a trade and a union, and migrant workers who can just change countries. And this has become much harder. And there's a lot of border controls that had been installed or that are about to be installed. And I think this is something we should keep in mind, that we are maybe making the problem even worse by trying to keep migrants away from Europe. So this is not a very optimistic view. To add something maybe not that pessimistic, what we see is a destruction of the concept of the classical political party at the moment. And it happens at the same time as, you will probably talk about that later, kids going on, demonstrating on the streets in a way we've never seen before. So maybe there's some part of a solution that we can't predict now, but I think there is the concepts that political parties are offering people who are concerned about what's happening are not enough, obviously. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these kids on the streets. We wouldn't have a decline of the biggest parties. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, why that's happening, but yeah. So to sum it up, I really don't know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we will come back in a minute on the issue of how to govern international migration and all the problems and topics there on the table. But I want first to ask Tatjana Müller. Thanks, Tatjana Müller. You're an expert on social movements. So, and you highlighted in the quotation I have seen that the Friday for Future movement might be one of the most important social movements in recent times. And perhaps there is a glance of optimism at the end of the tunnel, I don't know, given that the, let's say, the political system otherwise is not able to address the issue in a meaningful way. What do you think is the role of the social movements in this game?
Given that I'm the only person from a climate perspective on this panel, there's about 7 things I would like to say. But the first are, I'm sorry I have a cold, so I'll sound a bit weird. Secondly, just because you looked at me, I'm not at part of the Rosa Luxemburg. I'm with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, but not the Left Party. I would like to make it very clear that in no way do I speak for, justify, or explain the climate policy of the Left Party. Right, just a quick. So thanks very much for inviting me. There's a few things I'd like to say before I get to social movements. I think they're kind of important. The first one is, I think there's a widespread misunderstanding that climate policy consists of countries or companies reducing emissions. So-called mitigation. Now, it doesn't consist of that in 2 ways. The first is that that's only one of the policy fields traditionally associated with climate policy. The other is so-called adaptation funding or financing. Because even if Germany were to reduce its emissions from its greenhouse gas emissions, which it doesn't in any way, shape, or form, and that's quite important to remember, then climate change would still happen around the world. It's priced into the system. There's a so-called historic responsibility for that, which, by the way, makes the OECD countries much worse in terms of their impact on the climate than just their current ratio of emissions that they emit. Now, adaptation financing means the global north coughing up money for stuff that it's fucked up in the rest of the world. Now, as a result, that kind of money isn't usually forthcoming. It is precisely, however, the kind of money that would have to be forthcoming to deal with the local and regional effects of displacement based as a result of climate and the many other social conflicts and problems that normally produce really existing migration and displacement. Now, you said yourself at the beginning of your talk, and I thought it was interesting, the countries that have contributed least to climate change are the most affected. And, you know, it's the other way around it works. The countries that are least affected by climate change are the ones that have caused it. That means if they have caused it, and if the problem then today is climate poverty and local climate poverty, what we should really be talking about here is how does the global north recognize and start making reparations for the enormous climate debt that it owes. That is the conversation we should be having, because mitigating climate change, that is to say reducing emissions, will have effects. If you reduce methane emissions in 12 years, then you'll have effects in 12 years. as in less climate change. If you now reduce CO2 emissions, you'll have effects in 50 years. But money has effects now, and it is the one thing that the global north tends to not want to talk about when it talks about climate change and migration and these things. And it's very important that we get that clear. So when we talk about climate change and migration, we really have to talk about funding, and funding that has no strings attached, because given that this is a climate debt that the North owes the South, I don't know how it works when you pay your debt back to your bank. I usually don't attach conditions to my bank when I pay back debt. So we have to change the debate. There's climate policy. When it comes to migration, let's not talk about mitigation, because that'll affect in several years. We have to talk about financing from the north to the south right now, which is a debt that we owe. So that's the first point. Secondly, climate alarmism. I do find it funny how economics uses models in a way that assumes that there is stability, that there's linearity in a field where climate scientists by now know that the existence of tipping points in the climate specifically and more generally means that it's quite possible that within this century the global climate system will stop being in a stable state and tip into an unstable state. Now, 10 to 12,000 years of human history have happened pretty much in the so-called Holocene, a period of stable climatic situation. What if that were to tip into an unstable state? Beyond 2 degrees global warming, the likelihood of tipping in an unstable state is more than 50%. That would sort of like knock out all these long-term modeling systems, because it would actually change the setup of the whole climate structure in the world. So we need to think about this in a much more alarmist way. We're not going for 1.24 degrees, we're going towards 3 to 7 degrees. Now, those are the centrist predictions. They're no longer at 1 to 4 degrees. That's kind of 15 years ago. Just wanted to clarify that. And lastly, what's the role of social movements? Sorry, I added those to some preambles. The role of social movements is, unlike political parties, we're not creatures of compromise. Now, you will remember the Coal Commission that was set up by Germany to discuss the coal phase-out. Well, it was actually called the Commission on Economic Growth, Structural Change and Employment. Well, that's also why it didn't produce a decent coal phase-out date. But it basically debated climate policy as a matter of compromise between pensions, jobs, growth, taxes, anti-fascism, because of the connection between climate policy and the rise of the AfD, and so on and so forth. And obviously it came up with a bad number for the climate. It came up with a coal phase-out by 2038, which is a completely useless policy move, because if one of the richest countries in the world, which is also a lignite world champion, gets out of producing that dirtiest of all fossil fuels, only 20 years from now, no other country in the world will have any decent anti-fossil policies. So, political parties are creatures of compromise. Social movements can make simple, straightforward points. And Fridays have made a key point. There are no compromises with the climate, because issues that relate to global planetary boundaries aren't issues that can be negotiated. You can't say, could you please postpone climatic collapse in Southeast Asia and beyond by 10 years, just because we need to fight our fascists and not actually shut down jobs in heavy industrial regions. That's not doable, because you can't actually have a compromise with the global climate system. So basically, social movements are the only actor right now that is putting forth the real positions that relate to relevant climate policy and climate science. Because they're not creatures of compromise, they have, as it were, or we have the luxury of saying things that are true and obvious, but that can't be said by political parties because of the vested interests that make up the real coalitions that are political parties. So in that sense, I would say the decline of parties in the climate area is connected to the emergence of an actor, the young generation, or Generation Climate as I like to call them, that for the first time in years actually speaks to the way people really experience climate change, namely as the potential disappearance of the future. It's nothing to do with jobs. It's got nothing to do with taxes. Climate change is the potential disappearance of the future. And only movements are actually articulating that real affective experience that people are having. Sorry that took a long time, but there was a few things I had to correct on the climate field.
Okay, thanks a lot. So there are now a lot of issues on the table. We need a global refunding mechanism. We need much more radical measures, which will not happen in our political system because it's minded to compromise. And perhaps we look a bit at the global issues. Yeah, and I think you added one other part. I think there are two issues on the table. Yeah. One is, Catarina Lowenstein mentioned that also the ambassador has migration policies to change somehow. That is one issue, because I think it's a very difficult issue because there are nothing like climate migrants which we can recognize as climate migrants. They are not different from other types of migration. But still, we have to consider whether we have to adjust in one way or another our the global governance of migration, and that means in particular the governance of migration to the rich countries. That is one big issue on the table. And the other issue you have raised, what about if we have externalities which damage poor countries and increase global poverty? Poverty within those countries, but also poverty across countries, then what you call reparations or financial compensations, how we could establish something like that. So that's very far away from what we have in the moment in the political area. But of course it would be efficient, because if we would internalize the cost and the damages we have, then there would be higher incentives to reduce, for example, CO2 emissions. Okay, it's not an obligation to everybody to respond to these big questions, but perhaps, Ambassador, you have an idea to say something about the migration system, global migration systems, because I think you know one or two things about that.
Thank you very much. And very interesting inputs from the rest of the panel. Really, it's an education for me too, not being a climate change expert. But in terms of global migration, I think the challenge really is it's very difficult to pin down global migration governance, which is why you have all these conflicts, all these issues domestically in different countries, in different regions. Even in my region, in the Asia Pacific, you have really a mix of migrant receiving countries, and then you have migrant sending countries. Just in Southeast Asia, for example, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, these are essentially migrant receiving countries. And then you have countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, which are migrant sending countries. So there are issues, and there is really no global overarching global governance mechanism. There are attempts, and there are several pathways that countries and governments are trying to put together. There was, as I mentioned, the Global Compact on Migration and Development, which is a very recent development, but it's not a legally binding document. It is a moral document, and the challenge is now for stakeholders to pressure governments, to pressure national policymakers and regional and international policymakers to make good on the promises and the objectives, at least the 23 objectives in that Global Compact. There are international instruments, but again, because migration is such a divisive and conflict-riddled issue, for example, the Convention on Migrant Workers, for example, has not even reached the number needed for it to come into effect. And the campaign has been going on for many years. Even in Southeast Asia, within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the most that we've been able to get, and it's already a milestone for us, is to have a declaration on migrant workers, on migration, on the humane treatment of migrant workers and cross-border cooperation. The Global Compact, the GCM, was a major leap forward, but again, because international politics, because multilateral platforms involve a lot of negotiation also. The only way that they could come up with that global compact is to make it non-binding. To have a legally binding instrument, an international convention, for example, on migration, would involve many, many years and even more compromises. So that is the challenge now, and of course embedded now in the objectives under the Global Compact of Migration is the recognition of the nexus between climate change and migration, whether it's internal migration, whether it's country to neighboring country migration, sub-regional migration, or even region to region migration, people migrating because of climate factors, because of environmental changes and disruptions, to livelihood, to their way of life, to communities, from developed countries to the higher income countries. So again, the difficulty here, the challenge really is because a lot of these are results of compromises and these are negotiated documents. All these are negotiated documents, how to empower the stakeholders now to really put the pressure. Because these are not legally binding, they're morally binding. But that makes the challenge even more acute now. How to convince a country which has signed on to the Global Compact to make good in terms of policies, in terms of really meeting the objectives that they signed on to.
Yeah, I don't know, wants to take over to saying to the want of, well, to address both of the big questions, of the governance of migration. Has it something to change because of climate change, and if so, how? Because we know we have many proposals on the table, for example, for governing labor migration. But I wonder, and that can be popular, to have high-skilled labor migration. But I wonder whether that is a tool to address climate migration. I have some doubts about that. I don't know whether in your party platform or are there discussions, because I'm afraid it's not very popular.
You already mentioned the existing concerns. I share that. I mean, let's see the situation in Europe. We have, unfortunately, in many of the member states of the European Union now existing right-wing parties. Some of them are already in power. Some of them are rising. And so we have to find a way to make sure that the democratic side still has a majority and is able to act. And we see more and more countries where that's not the case anymore. So even in my own constituency in Stuttgart, we had the so-called yellow vests. And believe me, it was not very comfortable to go there and to have a dialogue with them because they have a completely different way in looking into the issues as we do here. And they're existing as well. And we know in France the impact it had on their policy in the fight against climate change. So I think it would be a completely wrong kind of job sharing if we would say, well, there is one part of the society that is dealing with the necessity of the fight against climate change, and then there is another part of the society which has a completely different view, and they're completely disconnected. Just have in mind the reality in the United States. Let me give you that example. When I talk to my liberal friends in the US and I ask them, will Trump win the nomination inside the Republican Party? That was before the last presidential election. They all told me, impossible, completely unthinkable. He will never win the nomination inside the Republican Party. And when he won the nomination in the Republican Party, I asked them again, very smart people, much smarter than me. They have studied in the most excellent universities in the United States, very expensive universities. And they told me, he will never win the presidency. And they gave me very reasonable arguments. The Latinos, the African American, the women, the East Coast, the West Coast. They had the mathematical models explaining me that it's completely unthinkable and unrealistic that that may happen. And it happened. So you can imagine me, I don't want to call them again and ask them a prediction for the outcome of the next presidential election because I fear their estimations. So I'm saying this because I see this country going towards a similar path. If you know, look at the last elections. The European Parliament elections were great for my party. But if you go deeper into the analysis of the elections, what you see is the re-establishment of the wall between the East and the West. There's a huge difference between East and West. Then you have a second division. There's a huge difference between the big cities and the rural area. And if you go deeper into that, you see a huge difference between the age groups. So let me come back with my point, with my initial point. If you really want to change in a drastic way, and nobody has to convince me that the drastic conversion of the society is necessary if we want to do what is necessary in order to transform the society. We need to reach out beyond the already convinced communities. And if anybody has good ideas, please let me know, because this is, you know, keeping me busy even in my dreams, what we can do there. But there is some good news. The good news is that those communities who you would expect are the most skeptical ones are rather open-minded. The unions, for instance, the IG Metall. It's fascinating to see that they resist the pressure from within, you know, the working class, because the AFD unfortunately also has their own groups meanwhile in the working class, but the leadership of that union, which, as you know, is one of the biggest unions in the world, not only resists that, but says openly that there is no alternative to the fight against climate change, and that the car manufacturing industry has to do its part in the transition from the existing cars into emission-free cars. So that's the good news. The other good news is that even the modernizers in the business community have understood, sometimes because their kids are participating in Fridays for Future and so on, and they have their discussions at home, that this transition is necessary. The bad news is that the traditional parties that are close to the business communities still didn't understand that things are changing. So the existing model that we had so far, let me give you that with an example. The Volkswagen scandal is a perfect example for that. The model was, you know, one side is pretending that they produce the cars that are promised to the people. The other side, the state bureaucracy, is pretending that they're controlling. And both sides think this model will go on forever. And then, as you remember, the US Agency for Environment controlled that, and the scandal started, and meanwhile it cost 30 billion euros. 30 billion euros, that scandal. Imagine they would have invested that money into emission-free cars where we could be today. So this model completely failed. So now we're in the process of reinventing that. And the bad news is we will not solve the problem by just replacing the existing cars through electric cars. We also have to tell the message there will be less cars. Not 47 million cars as we have them today, we will have tomorrow. So less cars, and cars that some of them or most of them maybe will not be owned anymore, but will be shared, means the production of less cars. So again, this is something which is easy to tell here, but it's less easy to talk about that in my constituency, which is Stuttgart, where Daimler has its center, Porsche has its center, and believe me, I do this there with the workers, and that's what we have to do. The only choice we have in our developed countries, we have to reach out to our constituencies and talk with them about the necessity of the transition. It's not something, you know, preaching to the converted, that's easy. But we have to reach out in order to avoid a situation, as I mentioned, like in the US or in other countries, where we find ourselves overnight confronted with the other side that has a completely different view on the topics we're talking about.
Catarina Lowenstein, you have voiced the concern that even the Refugee Convention might be, or that many advanced countries might opt out of that if we include climate refugees, however defined, into that, which may be likely, or very likely, given that the Geneva Convention is anyway under pressure, as we can see today. Could you consider other approaches of governing migration? Because I think climate migrants, if we have not the conflict scenario, which we had in Frédéric's scenarios, but if we think about the standard scenarios, if I may say so, those climate migrants are not refugees in the traditional sense. So that are labor migrants, family migrants, whatever. Would you see options for the governance of migration in those areas which might be helpful?
I mean, Germany does try to open up more channels, but apparently it has been quite hard to find the migrants that the German government would like to have, the highly skilled Indian computer programmer guy, but
with German vocational training degrees, yes, you don't exactly find so many in
and you can see it if you have a look at the negotiations between the European Union and countries like Morocco, for example. I find it very interesting that there seems to be a bit of a shift in power. It's just like a very slight shift, but it's remarkable that some countries that are transit countries for migrants coming from West Africa, for example, they have a certain power towards Europe. So there is the Moroccan government that doesn't just nod to any suggestion that's coming from the EU. They have very, very strong ideas about what they want from the European Union, which is, for example, visa for students, which is, for example, legal channels for migrants who want to work. So there could be some change in that field. What I found very interesting in the last couple of years was that while we were stuck on the national level in the EU at least, you could see how the EU countries struggled to relocate just like 40,000 migrants from Italy and Greece, and it hasn't worked out until now. So it's just an example to show you how hard it is to find a solution on the national level. You could at the same time see how active the cities were. I think this is a very interesting player because even in countries like Poland, with a government that doesn't want any migrants at all, or any refugees at all, you have cities that are part of this network of international cities like sanctuary cities or cities that welcome refugees or migrants, that they are getting stronger and stronger. Of course, they are not the same as the national level. I don't want to exaggerate their importance, but it's going to be very exciting to follow what's happening on this level in the next couple of years, because wherever you go, in the US, in European countries, you have mayors that are much more creative in finding solutions to provide work, to provide like an integration structure for people who arrive in a city. And this is what's maybe an outcome of 2015 and 16 also in Germany. If you talk to mayors, for example, they say we are sort of prepared for another influx of refugees because we have set up the structures. We have our best practices. We had it was like practicing on a very practical level what's happening if you have 10 buses full of people coming from Syria and Afghanistan in front of your town hall, and you have to put them somewhere. You have to provide food. You have to provide beds for them. So it's not going to be something that can ever replace solutions on a national level, but there is some strong motivation that you can see in cities to solve the problem and to face the problem. I think this is a big difference, and it's going to be interesting to have a look at that, I guess.
Okay, you have put several points on the table, and I'm grateful for that. Can you say perhaps something about if we would do those policy changes? I think everybody, if we, let's say, introduce reparations, if we change our migration policies, everybody, and if we reduce eventually then as a consequence of that also our CO2 emissions, we would be in a better world. That's for sure.
That'd be a lot better place.
That's for sure. The question is how we are getting there, and what can we say from an analytical perspective on, I don't know, proposals which bringing us on that way forward.
So how can we get there? If I could just tell a quick story. So I've been doing climate activism for 12 years. I was with the climate camps and with Ende Gelände, and I was in Hambacher Wald, and for several years, it was a few thousand lefty eco-radical cadre who were basically tasked by society, which in Germany hasn't ever, so there's no political climate policy in that. The only reason why we have low emissions rates in Germany compared to 1990 is because of the deindustrialization of the East on the one hand, and the changing patterns of production where we've offshored most of our dirty industrial production. So there is no governmental official climate protection policy. That's literally not the case. So since the Paris Agreement, where government said we're going to save the planet and then immediately made it clear that they wouldn't do anything of the sort, activists, 2,000 to 5,000 radicals, have been the societal bearers of climate change, climate policy. That's obviously not a sustainable thing. And that kind of came to a head last year when the Coal Commission sort of said, okay, we're not going to get out of coal until 2038. And that is the moment where this young generation arises and can organize 1.4 million people onto the streets on the 20th of September, which is one of the largest peacetime demonstrations in Germany. There are scientists for future, there are psychologists for future, there are metal workers for future, there are faggots for future, there are sex workers for future, there are teachers for future, there are probably various types of migration academics for future. Like, honestly, I'm not sure. The for future frame is quite a powerful one, because we have lost the ability to speak about an attractive future. The right wing harks back to the 1950s, and the traditional left harks back to the 1970s. Parts of the Green movement or Green Party seem to hark towards a future where, in the fully automated luxury future where we all have lots and lots of electric cars, but the reality is that there will have to be a fundamental social transformation, and for that it needs an actor with a certain moral and discursive force behind which other societal actors can gather, can arrange themselves, in Gramscian terms, a new hegemonic coalition. And that coalition has to be led by the young. You know why? Until the emergence of the young generation in the global north as a political actor, the majority of people in the global north have an interest in continuing an unjust world economy that produces climate poverty in the global south and enriches us. Like, basically, the Dutch cities can guard against rising sea levels, Bangladeshi cities drown. Now, there is a material interest in continuing that economics because we're the ones who externalize the negative effects of our actions onto others. Lessenich called that in an externalization society. So what are the youth? The youth are the first actor that en masse has an interest in changing that system. The youth have said there's an antagonism between them and us older lot who have actually created that unjust economy. So it is behind the strategic and moral leadership of the young generation that the only path towards an even vaguely climate-just future lies, because the young generation is the first mass actor in the global north that has an actual material interest in saving the bloody climate. Therefore, they are our hope and our future, and if you haven't been to the demonstrations, why the fuck? And secondly, go. Fridays, 12 o'clock, wherever you are in this country or on this continent. Thanks.
Yes.
I've got got a question to Cem Özdemir.
Yep.
Because when we were talking about how to address climate migration policy-wise, I would be curious about the suggestions by the Greens. If I remember well, just before the European elections, you suggested to have something like a climate passport, and this is something we haven't talked about. So New Zealand had issues it for Kiribati, people coming from Kiribati, for the Pacific Islands, making access easier. So I still haven't understood how precisely you would model that, but I think it's an interesting instrument, maybe.
Well, me neither, because we're just on the process of creating that, but we brought that to the floor, and this will be certainly one of the points we will negotiate if we have the opportunity to come into power and negotiate about a future government, together, by the way, by the other thing that Tazio mentioned with the funds. Remember when Ecuador asked for economic support, I think it was the Yasumi National Park, and said, give us money, so we will not drill, we will not look for oil. And unfortunately, at that time, it was not possible to get that money. And I mean, compared to, you know, what it is worth, the money was, I think, not something that would have ruined us. So I think
$80 million destroyed by Dirk Niebel, specifically.
I think
it was Dirk Niebel who actually killed the German contribution to the. Sorry.
Yeah, I remember that the Minister of Development. The Minister of Development at that time refused that, and I think that was a very stupid move, because if Germany would have moved ahead, I think we could have convinced others in Europe to go ahead there. And I believe that is, besides dealing with refugees, climate change refugees, policy to prevent climate change from happening, that we have to pay. We have to pay, transform money from the north to the south, because as you have proven in your research, the south will be affected much more than the north will be affected. I mean, the north will be already affected in a drastic way. And it's, you know, for me as a Swabian, it's so ineffective, you know, how we waste money. Instead of investing the money today, we wait for the crisis to come, and then we have to pay much more money than we would have to pay today. So that, I think, would be part of such a program. But again, it's not enough to convince the Green Party. We need to convince others, and then we need to convince other countries in the European Union in order to make this a European policy, makes these kind of deals. I would even go so far with countries like Brazil, because, I mean, Bolsonaro is a fascist guy, he's a horrible guy. But when Brazil says, we need money for the rainforest to be protected, I think we should go much further than we've done so far.
One thing about the convincing people. Young people are quite interesting into the way they can convince people. Adults believe and trust young people more, and you can all see that in your reaction to Greta Thunberg, whatever it was. And they, as a generational actor, exist in all ideological, regional cohorts of society. Basically, young children exist everywhere, in conservative, fascist, socialist, and green families. Ergo, if you have a communicational strategy based on young people, you can at least potentially reach all sectors of society.
Can I add one sentence? My daughter is part of Fridays for Future, and one of the things she tells me is when I see the slogans they create, I think, I mean, this is such a creative generation. That's exactly the kind of energy, power we need in order to do the transformation. And I fully agree with you. They also have the power to reach out to communities beyond that. And that's what they're doing, actually. They're not, you know, sitting in their, you know, middle-class families and have not understood that they have to reach out to other communities. They're doing that. They're sitting together with unions and so on. But I see one danger, and that's what my daughter told me, and when I talked to her class friends, you know, you see more and more flags of political parties trying to hijack that. You see more and more, you know, activists from, you know, former radical groups that never reached out to large communities and see that as their opportunity to finally, you know, take over. Please don't take over that generation. Let it be the movement of these young people with their creativity, with their ideas. Let them make their mistakes, let them go too far, whatever they want to do, it's their perfect right, but let them take the lead. Don't take over from radical groups, from, you know, older people, because I see that more and more, and that's what I hear already, you know, from the class of my daughter, that they say it's not exactly the same anymore as it was in the beginning, because you see, they want to speak now instead of letting us speak and so on. They give us advices, what we have to do, and that we're naive and so on. I think that's exactly what makes them so great, and that they reached out to communities far beyond the traditional communities.
I have one very last question to Ambassador Dizon-De Vega before we give the floor to Frédéric for some concluding remark. My question is, if you follow those discussions in Germany, perhaps also in other countries which are the main causes of climate change, what do you wish to happen there which really helps your country?
Well, I won't comment too much on the political and the domestic conditions. That's in my universe that, you know, that doesn't really work very well. But let me just say that the Philippines for many years now has been very strong on its positions on climate justice and climate funding, and we've been in the thick of the fight. For the longest time, there's been debate about there's really no green climate fund model. There are modalities. It's just that the modalities, unfortunately, have been also the victims of compromise and negotiation. But at some point in time, really the modalities have to show that somehow the system works, that countries which need the funding most to address climate change concerns, climate change factors, and to really empower communities which are going to be the most severely affected by climate change. And in many cases, there are countries in Asia, in the MENA region, and of course, there are also the socio-economic issues. There are many, at least in the Philippine case, many of the most extreme, the most vulnerable victims of climate change are also the most vulnerable in terms of socio-economic capacity. These are subsistence fishermen, these are subsistence farmers, these are small, micro, and medium entrepreneurs. With every single typhoon, their entire businesses could be wiped out. Their entire livelihoods could be wiped out. And for the longest time, we've been fighting for, and we've been hoping to be able to get more cooperation in terms of funding for capacity building for these communities. So, and we've not given up. We're still in discussions. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we were in discussions in Incheon in South Korea for the Green Climate Fund discussions, and really this is something that we've been pushing. In fact, our government has issued some threats in recent years that if climate justice and if climate funding does not move at a faster pace, then what's the point of sending delegations and adding to the carbon footprint? But we continue that. We have to be engaged. We have to continue our engagement. Otherwise, who's going to fight for these communities, for the most vulnerable of our people and our communities who need the funding the most?
Thank you so much, Frédéric. Yep.
Okay, so it was a passionate debate, and thank you for all the comments or the reactions that I heard. Maybe a minor remark to start with on the Philippines. I think we take into account the situation of the country quite well, because you are an outlier in the Philippines in terms of immigration. Many economic migrants are abroad, 10% of the population now. And in fact, you know, when you compare with countries at this level of development, around $3,000, I think, per capita, you find that you have a much bigger immigration rate. And in our simulations, when climate change arises, Because people can count on their network, their diaspora abroad, we find more reactions in the Philippines than elsewhere. But most of the reactions are in countries where income per capita is below, let's say, 1,500 per year. And in these cases, migrating abroad is super difficult. For the rest, and more generally, I heard very sensible reactions to my presentation and sensible solutions. I'm not in politics. I'm not a climate expert. I would be a super bad politician and super bad activist. So I can just react with evidence-based thing that comes from my model and my expertise. And in fact, you discussed three ways to deal with climate change: mitigation, adaptation, and maybe a new governance of global migration, which will include refugee migration. Just my reactions, which is really evidence-based on these three aspects, is that I think mitigation, even if it's quite late today, we cannot escape climate change, but mitigations policies are very important. I heard yesterday in the news that a few years ago, when we wanted to target 1.5 degrees of increase in temperature, we needed a reduction, I think, per year of 3.3% of CO2 emission. We have done nothing, and today, for reaching the same objective, we need 7.6%. So for sure, we are delaying, we are postponing the effort, and it's very important because when you compare my scenario with 2 degrees and the scenario with 4 degrees, in fact, with 2 degrees of increase in temperature, extreme poverty in the world increases by almost 1 percentage point. So the percentage of people living with less than 2% of the average world income increases by slightly less than 1 percentage point. If we move to 4 degrees, this percentage increases by 5 percentage points. So the poverty implications of this rise in temperature is nonlinear and is convex. So the more we can do today, the lower will be the poverty response to migration. I'm totally aware of what you said. When I present this paper in front of economists, they say, well, that's comparable to something else, but the migration technology is better. When I present in front of climatologists, what they say is that your benchmark scenario plus 2 degrees and plus 4 degrees, today we are much above. So we still keep the benchmark that is used in many studies, but we have also simulated plus 6 degrees, plus 3 meters in the sea level, and all these effects on poverty inequality are exponential, are convex. So we need really to think about mitigation. Even if it's too late today, let's minimize the cost for the future. Adaptation. I have nothing evidence-based to say about that. A lot of sympathy for what has been said. In my talk, I said that we have contributed the most to climate change. And so I'm really sympathetic with this idea of reparation. I think we have to help poor countries facing this or dealing with these disasters. We have to help people adapt in agriculture, because my inverted U-shape productivity temperature function means that farmers are switching from one crop to the other when temperature is changing. So they adapt. If they do not adapt, my costs are lower bounds, super lower bounds. So it's very important to help them adapting in agriculture, and also to help sustainable urbanization in poor countries, because I'm persuaded, I'm convinced that people prefer to stay in a home country. Everybody thinks that if we liberalize migration today, we will be invaded by migrants. 50% of the world population would change. When you ask people in the street in all countries of the world, this is what Gallup did, would you like to leave your country if you had the opportunity, a visa, a monetary transfer? 12% of the population only say yes, despite huge inequality. So intervening, locally is super important. Then you have this global migration governance, and perhaps the inclusion of climate refugee into this system. That's a clear, tough questions. Defining what a climate refugee is almost impossible. The simulations show that 85% of those who are flooded, impacted by the sea level, 85% move locally. And we assume that they lose 50% of their lifetime earning, which is what you find in countries in conflict. But it's even more costly to move internally in another region or internationally. So we need these interventions. But those who are moving internationally are the most skilled people, are the highly educated people. And in fact, instead of helping the others left behind, it deteriorates the situation of those left behind. It's always like that. The best, the talents are moving first, the best in terms of productivity, if you want. And those left behind are the victims. So many of these forced displacements are local. Most of the international movements are voluntary, people affected by economic conditions. Defining a status of refugee is very complex. And suppose that we relax the migration restrictions today vis-à-vis these poor countries, the first, except if we do a screening, which is ethically and economically very costly, except with a very strict screening of people, the best will leave first and will aggravate, accentuate the situation in the poor countries. So mitigation, adaptation, I'm totally in favor. Defining the complex migration policy response is a very tough problem. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I wish to thank first very much Frédéric for his contribution and his statement, and I also wish to thank all participants of the panel. Thank you so much. We have outside some drinks, and thank you so much. I think it was a very interesting evening. Thank you for your attention.